Okay, I want to spend some time with us today and talk a little bit about effective questioning in the science classroom. How do we use questioning? Because a good teacher makes you think even when you don't want to. This is from Fisher and Teaching Thinking in 1998, where they mentioned the idea that teaching involves sometimes getting students to think about things that they wouldn't otherwise want to think about or wouldn't be able to think about without the environment, structure, and the way of which a teacher is presenting particular material. So questioning is one of the most important skills in getting students to do this thing. Do those things and be effective in their thought processes. Questioning is engaging. It's evaluative. It's efficient, and that I can engage students sometimes through a single question. I can use a question in order to figure out exactly where a student's misconceptions are taking place. And they're very efficient. They're quick, easy ways of getting data back, observations back on student understanding that then I can use to turn my classroom a certain direction, turn my lesson to face toward those things that I know students need, and to move on past those things that my students already understand. So we're going to use our time today to talk a little bit about common types of instructional questions. Types of questions you might see, the need for diversifying the type of questions that we ask, how to write those questions, and then techniques that you can use to make the most of the classroom questions that you have so diligently prepared for your classes. So the ability to think, to be a lifelong seeker and integrator of knowledge is based on the ability to ask and consider important questions. That's what Ricchetti and Sharon said back in 1999. In other words, if you want to be a lifelong learner, you have to be able to not only seek out information, but you have to be able to take that information and integrate it into your current conceptual frameworks, into your current understandings. Now, the way you do that as a learner is to be able to first be confronted with considerable questions, be able to consider important questions. Important questions. Maybe the question of what is with a blank underneath it is not always an important question. Sometimes it might be. But not just to be able to consider important questions, but then as a lifelong learner to be able to generate your own questions. That's where the power of lifelong learning comes in, to be able to figure out, what do I not know? What do I not really know about it? How can I ask myself a question and then go seek out that information to fill in that area, that gray area, or that blind spot in my current conceptual framework of what I'm trying to learn? So as teachers, our art and our science really is in the ability to ask quality questions, and that starts with crafting them. Good teachers don't always just come up with questions on the fly that are magical. That moment, that magic moment that we see in the movies where the teacher in the front of the room comes up with this beautifully elaborate question that just spurs their students on, usually doesn't happen in a real classroom. Usually it takes a large amount of time for teachers to actually develop quality questions. Now, a good question is short, thought-provoking, and ambiguous, clearly stated, has a common vocabulary, it's comprehensive, straightforward, relevant, related to the objectives at hand. The problem is that getting all of these in one question is next to impossible. To get a short question, many times it can't be clearly stated. Sometimes in science you have to have a slightly longer question to get all of the details in place. For it to be straightforward sometimes means that relevance suffers. So every time this is a balancing act on what creates and crafts a good question. But for the most part, what you need to make sure you're covering is that the questions you're looking at are related to your objectives in class. Always, always make sure that the path that you're developing your questions under relate to that objective, relate to your goal. So ask yourself things like, is the question directly related to a curriculum objective? Can I point out how this question helps develop the understanding of the student toward a particular student expectation, toward a particular learning goal or performance indicator that I have in my curriculum? Also ask yourself, does the question actually engage learners' mental energies? In other words, is this just something they could look up on Google, or is this question going to be something that's going to have to make them think about the process, think about the concept of which we're talking about in class? And also, does the question generate critical thought? In other words, not only is it going to make them think, but are there opportunities in place that are going to actually be able to create moments where there's cognitive dissonance, there's opportunities for agreement and disagreement among people during a discussion. Does it require the student to actually infer, to look at data, to draw conclusions for themselves based on other things? That's the type of effective questioning that we want to aim for when we're looking at writing good questions. And different parts of the lesson are going to require different kinds of questions to effectively enable students to be able to develop the knowledge to proceed to the next steps. So an example of this is this tool is out in a Google link that I'll give you at the end of today's webinar. But it's simply a piece of paper you can fold like a letter fold into 3 places, and on one section list questions that you wish to ask the class and have in discussion before the lesson. These may be questions that check prior knowledge, that are designed to engage students and hook students into the lesson themselves, to check and see if students understood what was happening the day before in class, and how, especially when those things tie directly to today's learning objective. Then you've got questions that you're asking during the lesson itself. What questions are important for the students to really get out of the lesson? And questions to ask after the lesson. Questions that are designed to not only wrap up the lesson and make sure that every student has an awareness and an understanding at the cognitive level that you're aiming for, but also maybe ones that extend. Not only extend the idea further into their realm of understanding and their connections, of course, between other concepts, but also extend it into things that they may be covering the next day. So you already have the ability to kind of pre-plan a little bit about what are going to be some of the pitfalls in tomorrow's lesson that may trip up students even on their ability to connect today's material into tomorrow's activities. So this sort of pre-planning is very, very helpful. You may not have more than about 6 to 7 questions on this entire chart. 2 to 3 questions here, 2 to 3 questions for during the lesson, 2 to 3 questions for after the lesson. Out of these, as we talk about a little bit later, you're going to want to make sure you have somewhere between 2 to 5 questions that I would call are higher order questions. Questions that really, really stretch those students' understanding with high rigor, interspersed in these 3 parts of the lesson. Most of them will probably happen during the lesson itself, but you still need some higher level questions on either side of that, especially in the after the lesson section, to make sure that students did actually get what you were trying to address during your activities. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about types of questions that we see in a classroom. There are 3 types of non-instructional questions that you typically see in a classroom. And the first is a rhetorical question, a question that's asked where you're not expecting a response. This is very common. What type of question might I be asking at this point? Well, the type of question that or maybe I'm asking something along the lines of, okay, is everyone ready for the test? And maybe someone might be telling me no, but many times they won't. Procedural questions. Questions such as, do you have your paper today? Questions like, did you remember your pencil? Are we all lined up properly? Although that last one of are we all lined up properly is actually more of what I would call a demand style question. Demand questions are questions we don't really expect an answer from. We're expecting compliance. So it's a question of where we're asking as a question to be polite in a social fashion, but really we're requesting the student to do something, such as asking them, is everyone in your seat? We don't expect them to say, no, I'm not in my seat. We expect them to get into their seat. So that's a type of question we typically see in a classroom. Those 3 are non-instructional. That means mostly other types of questions we see that are instructional in nature really fall into 2 categories, either closed or open, narrow, broad, convergent, divergent. Any of those terminologies pretty much match this concept of the types of questions. So when I'm talking about crafting quality questions, I'm not really talking about those non-instructional types. Those just happen in the course of instruction, but they're non-instructional. What I really want us to focus on is writing and crafting quality questions that are instructional in nature, both narrow and broad types of questions. We see both of them, and both types are important. Narrowing questions are things that are like confirming questions, where maybe I'm asking something like, what is a particular thing? Integrating questions are also narrow. Narrow questions always have one correct answer. So it might be something as simple as, can you give me the definition of? And I'm asking for, or the definition of a certain term is this, what is that term? So there's really only one right answer. Integrating questions are where the student may have to be pulling together a lot of different information. Example of these would be things where maybe I'm working out a problem of some sort, where I've given the students F equal ma to work with, and I understand that I've asked them for a force. Well, at that point, there's really only one correct answer. But the students are going to have to go through a process to get that. They're going to have to integrate some understanding, maybe even some prior learning in order to get that one correct answer. Broad questions, open questions, divergent type questions, on the other hand, are very open-ended. That means there's more than one answer that's available. They can be values-based. So maybe I'm asking the students about what they believe ethically in that case. And I'm maybe asking them how they feel about a particular topic or subject that we're studying. So those are open questions. There's more than one correct answer that's possible through those. And these are probably some of the most powerful types of questions that we can ask students in a classroom. Because what we're noticing is that research shows us that that's not what we typically see, in particular in secondary science classrooms, but I would think elementary ones are very similar in this. That over 60% of the questions that are asked are simple recall type of questions, with another 20% of the questions in a typical secondary science classroom being procedural, and then only 20% of the questions involving critical thinking. Now, we'll always have some recall level questions, but with it being 60% of the questions, and knowing that teachers ask approximately 50 questions per hour of instruction, then that means that most of the recall questions themselves and the majority of questions that are being asked really never get us to an opportunity where students can and have to show and exhibit higher level thinking. So just some examples, make sure we understand narrow versus broad. Narrow, your questions like, what is light? Well, that's not a bad question, and maybe for most scientists, if I ask that question, we would get a multitude of answers. But for most students in a science classroom, something like the question of what is makes them open up their textbooks to the back of the glossary and give us back the textbook definition of light, whether they understand it or not. Or to look it up in the chapter, find where the word light is in bold, find the sentences around it, and construct a definition using the same words they see in those sentences around it. Instead, maybe I ask a broader question like, how will light affect future technologies? If you'll notice and think about how you would have to respond to that question, you'll notice that my definition, my understanding of light is integrated into that particular question. If I don't understand what light is, then that affects my determination of the types of future technologies I'm going to choose. So as a science teacher, I can listen to those responses and still get a very good understanding, a realistic understanding, I would say, of what the student really knows about light. While all I would get back in the narrow version of the question is probably the definition. Now, there's nothing wrong with closed questions. They're very important. They have their place in instruction, especially when I need to talk about things that need to be remembered or a process that needs to be followed. Because there are things in science and in the world that just have an expected answer or expected result, and they have to have that. But the problem is what happens when we get into the habit of just showing and just representing things with these closed or restricted questions. Examples like, how many different nucleotides are present in DNA? One particular answer. What is the charge commonly associated with an electron? Again, one particular answer. So specific knowledge has its place. The issue is that since we spend so much time on recall questions that are about specific knowledge, we don't usually get to the critical thinking questions, the more broader types of questions that need to be asked in the classroom. If you've ever watched Ferris Bueller, you'll understand, and maybe you've seen the scene with the economics teacher talking about voodoo economics and asking anyone, if you'll look at those questions, and I suggest you can always YouTube for that particular video, that you'll notice that every one of those questions are a closed question. He also answers every one of his questions. So divergent questions are designed to make them have to generate basically answers on their own. They're independent. They're based on their own ideas. Many times it's their own perspectives on the topic. Because of that particular type of question, we can get the same information by reading the subtext of the question that we usually are seeing in a closed response, but it doesn't allow the student to play the game of school and give us the answer they expect us to have. So to help take a closed question and write it more open, take a narrow question to write it more broad, think about turning questions around. If I ask you about commensalism, let's say, and I gave you a specific example where I said, which type of relationship is this when I talk about the relationship between the bees and flowers, let's say. Can you give me an example of what type of relationship? Is that symbiotic? Is it commensalistic? Is it mutualistic? Is it parasitic? I've given one example. There's one right answer. Instead, what if I asked it more openly? I ask, hey, can you give me an example of commensalism that you saw today? How about asking about similarities and differences? This is another really good way of taking a closed question and making it open. So, like, how is a chemical reaction like a junior high dance? Here I'm asking them to tell me, giving them an analogy, and I'm asking them to tell me the similarities and differences that were used to construct that analogy. You could just as easily also ask them to generate an analogy on their own about that. A chemical reaction is to a blank as blank is to blank, and have them generate their own analogies if they need to. Leave out numbers. We use numbers a lot in science classes, and so instead of something like calculate the force acted on by a 25-kilogram object, resulting in an acceleration of 3 meters per second, ask for something more generic. Something like, what happens to the force needed to accelerate an object as its mass is decreased? You could even do something like, what happens as its mass is doubled or tripled? Can you graph this? There's still only one right answer with this, but what I want the students to be able to see is the relationship. So can you graph or show this relationship? That's what's really important in it. Scientists and science teachers do not like the idea of a vague term. But what I mean by that is that we're asking questions where we're asking the students to kind of doesn't have to be the right answer. It has to be what they think. So I could ask what environmental factors might make a species population spike. And we get a list of those. And yes, some of them are probably not going to be correct. So then let's go through the class and talk about what makes those that are correct, what factors or variables and values make those other responses not correct. And also ask for more information. What do you know about this particular topic? Instead of just asking about the topic itself. So take a moment, pause the video if you'd like, look at this picture and think of the types of questions that you might be able to create from this particular picture. And take a moment and just pause it if you'd like. And develop about 3 or 4 questions that you think you might come up with. After you finish doing that, look also at the levels, the types of questions you're asking. Are they narrow or are they broad? If they're narrow questions, see if you can go back and use some of the steps that we've just talked about. You can always rewind the video and look and see if you can take those narrow questions and find a way to address them using one of the strategies to turn them into a broad question. Not that every question has to be broad when we discuss that and use it in class, but that way then you get a pretty good idea of how to do that to questions. When you start to notice that your questions are closing in, they're becoming closed and narrow type questions. It's typically narrow and closed type questions also have a very low Bloom's level. So take a moment, pause this, Okay, I'm going to go ahead and continue because I want to switch gears a little bit. Hopefully you've taken a moment, you've done this exercise, you've looked at it, and you have now decided that, okay, I get this idea of how to write questions, but there's just times when we have discussions where my discussions just don't go right. And that happens pretty often, actually, and it's not uncommon in science classrooms to be in the middle of a discussion and it almost feel like you've been painted into a corner by realizing that maybe students don't get an understanding of the direction we're trying to go, or they're not catching the questions. So included in the Googles is actually a couple of pages from a book called Understanding it's Understanding Design of Science Instruction. And these 4 pages, it's an NSTA book, actually list developing types of questions that you can ask to students. I call them middle questions. They're the questions that usually take place in the middle of a discussion that are very useful to kind of get you out of some of the ruts that you can get into very easily if you're not careful. Things like, if you want to help build students' confidence, rely on their understanding, ask things like, hey, why is that true? How did you reach that conclusion? You know, does that make sense? Can you draw a model to show that? If you're trying to get them to think and reason scientifically, can you come up with a counterexample? Can you show me a chance when this doesn't work? How would you prove that? You know, what assumptions are you making when you make that statement? You know, is that true for all cases? Can you explain why? These are you know, even these types of questions are things that if you have them stating a fact in a lab write-up or lab report, you can come back and ask these as follow-up questions. See if they're truly understanding the concept to that higher level. You know, other things to check for student progress. Why did you decide to use this procedure? This is one I use a lot when students are actually not following the directions in a lab activity that I may have given them. So I may ask, well, why did you choose to use that procedure? Well, because it's written here. Oh, really? Wait, that's not what those directions say. Oh, so you're saying that that's probably the issue. And other questions are very similar to this, but are much more open for use during inquiry type activities. Is there a more efficient strategy you could have used when you're working on a problem or solving it? Why did you decide to organize your results like this? That's a very important question because most of the time we notice that students get good data during the hands-on activity, they can't make the conclusion, and when you look at their data table you realize they have not organized their data table or they have not placed that data in a graphical form in order for them to actually see the relationships that's being shown through it. Other questions that you may be able to ask include things like when students are trying to collectively make sense of science during discussions. Do the rest of you agree? Why or why not? What do you think about what, you know, John said or Andrew said or Julio said? Do you understand what Betty is saying? Can you explain why your answer makes sense? These are very useful questions during discussion times. And to encourage hypothesizing, you know, what would happen if? What are some other possibilities? Can you predict what happens if you change the variable? So these would actually help encourage students to develop a hypothesis. And then to promote problem solving, what strategies are you going to use? I know there's been times in the past where science teachers have been taught a particular stepwise feature of developing scientific thinking, of promoting this idea of problem solving. When we realize that that doesn't work in every case. So maybe a series of questions that you can use, even post these up on a board somewhere and say, okay, we're fixing to start looking at a problem. Which ones of these questions would be useful for us to look at first? You know, what information do you have and what information do you need? What do you already know? What do you need to find out? What tools or equipment will you need? What do you think the answer or result will be? So there's things like this that you can ask the students to be thinking about, and even maybe in their what they figure out is maybe for particular types of problems there is a sequence that these questions can be answered in that's much more efficient. But for the most part, these questions work for any type of problem, whether it's a textbook problem or it's a problem dealing with a particular hypothesis in a lab or conceptual problem. These work to help solve problems. Now, we've talked a lot about the types of questions, some questions that you can use to help kind of spur on discussion and keep kiddos thinking. Now I want to talk a little about how you take these quality questions and make the most out of them. So take a moment and think about the fact of how many times do you say the words, uh-huh, that's right, good. These are machete words, and that means what will happen is that they usually cut discussion and they cut the student's understanding. When students hear these particular words, many times they think they've got the right answer, they've got an answer that's good enough, and that it's time to move on to something else. Instead of realizing that most of the time when teachers say these things, they're really trying to get the students to go further, to delve deeper than they are. So be careful when you're using these particular types of words in discussion time. Make your classroom an IDK-free zone. I don't say that there's anything wrong with saying I don't know. The problem is that typically when students respond with IDK, they really mean IDC, I don't care. So just at the beginning of a classroom discussion, and then further on, it typically works if this is done at the first of the school year, but you can implement this at any time, is to tell students we're going to make our classroom an IDK-free zone. So instead of saying I don't know, what are some other things that you might be able to say in its place, such as, can I ask a friend for help? Can you rephrase the question? Can I look that information up? And then the best strategy to do this probably is to create a chart or table that lists these stems for things you can say instead of I don't know up on the classroom wall, and then anytime students say I don't know, say, oh, remember we don't say that in here, you need to choose something from the list. And also do that for yourself. So if a student asks you a question and you don't know, say, well, you know, I would say I don't know, but I can't say that. Let's look and see what I can say instead. Maybe one of the things I want to do is can I look this up for you and follow through with that so they understand that everyone's playing by the same set of rules. We have traditionally always had this idea of classroom management during discussion with raised hands. And the problem with raising hands is that the students who know the answer raise their hand. And the minute that other students see the hand go up, they realize they won't be called. And so they stop thinking. So we waste a lot of time with students not thinking in class simply because someone else in the class got to the answer before they did. So one of the more traditional ways of handling this is to do a craft stick system, where you take tongue depressors, craft sticks, write the names of the students on them, place them in a container like a coffee mug, and then randomly draw out students' names. You want to do this where it's most useful. So one way of using this technique is with what we call a QRQ process. So you'll ask your question, provide wait time, then you would draw the craft stick out. You want to make sure that everybody has to think about the question during this first wait time. You don't want only one student thinking while the other 25 or 30 in the room are just sitting there waiting for that student's wait time and think time to elapse. Everyone needs to be thinking about the question. Then the student responds. Now, we've typically done a good job in our teacher training of talking about wait time and the teacher asks a question, waiting, the student respond. But I want to add one more wait time to this cycle. The idea with this past wait time is I want the other students in the class to understand that I'm about to call on them based on the response of this first student. So they need to be thinking and listening to what that student says. They need to be able to respond to that student. So I need to give them some think time. This think time also becomes very useful to the teacher in the room, because during this particular second wait time or second think time is when I'm going to work to craft my next question, to make sure that it's efficient, that's engaging, try to make it fit the discussion to its very most and to the best benefit of the bit of both time and students. So this second wait time is very important. Get the students used to the fact that you are going to call on them and you're using that other wait time to let them know that, and that you want them thinking about the response. Be overt about it if you need to at first as you begin to use this process in your classrooms. Tell them, I'm going to sit there and I'm going to think about the student's response. I want you to do the same because we'll talk about that response and we'll discuss it. This means you're not going to cover 50 questions during a class period. It may mean you cover 10 questions in the class period, 15 questions, but that's okay. The idea is that we want all the students thinking through the questions. We want all of them being able to respond to it, and we want them all ready to respond to them. Don't stop at one question either. If you get a right answer, extend it. Continue to work on taking a set of questions maybe that you've written down and expanding upon them. Hollow out, figure out exactly where students' areas of misconception might be taking place. Also figure out what they really know, where you don't have to go over that stuff again. Hold out for outstanding. There is no such thing as a right answer that is, well, that is correct except for. No, it's incorrect. So lead students to the point to where they're giving you an entirely correct answer. Don't just take accept a little bit of right, accept the whole right. Hold out and get outstanding out of your kids till they get it. And don't accept the side steps or leap forwards that we usually see students attempt to do, where maybe we've asked them to work to give me the next step in a problem and they go ahead and just give me the answer. I didn't want the answer. I want the next step. I want you to tell me the process that you used, the thinking process you used to come to your conclusion, because that's really what's important most of the time. Stretch it. Figure out exactly where you need to go, and if you get there, go beyond it. Go in a spot where you can get to relevance with students in almost everything you do. See if you can go farther than you had to go, because every time you get beyond that point, you usually end up getting into areas that spur additional student interest and also provide more sticky areas for those other concepts you're going to cover in the next days, next weeks, maybe even the next years of the student's educational life to really adhere to the content you're teaching that day. And don't be sorry for being the person on campus that asks the tough questions. Don't apologize for saying, oh, I've got to tell you, I've got this question for you and it's hard, I'm so sorry. So don't do that. And also remember that when we ask our typical questions we do at the end of a certain instructional sequence and we're about to start something different, like, well, what did you get? Hey, does everybody understand? Does anybody have any questions? We ask those questions wholeheartedly meaning them, but most students are not listening because they're preparing to go on to the next thing we have planned, whether that's working on homework or getting into the lab, whatever that is. So to help students understand that these are relevant questions you really want to know, say, okay, does everybody understand? Does anybody have any questions? Okay, now I have some questions for you, and ask those questions. Make them have to actually respond to them. The trick is, where we're really wanting to go with our questions is to make students ask questions of one another. That's what's really important. Because when we start to get students asking their own questions, we can see them moving down the cone of learning. The further down the cone of learning we get, the more active they become in their learning, and also the more the material, the content, the expectations we have for them will continue to stay with them. Any questions? Well, then I have some questions for you. As you finish up this webinar, I want you to think about what insights you've gained. What will you implement immediately? What are things that you can do to use some of the information out of this webinar tomorrow in class? What has been validated for you? What are you doing that you think's right? What are things you've been doing? Hey, that's exactly what I do, and I thought that's what I should be doing. And what will you do maybe differently as a result of this session? So I'll leave you with those questions to answer for yourself. I have materials available at this particular Google link and at this QR code that are helpful and help extend the information from this webinar. And they're freely available. And at any time you need help, you can always contact me at Region 14 through my email address listed here. And remember, we're also on Twitter at R14Science. Thanks, and I'll talk to you later.